Good evening, everyone. Very warm welcome to the Frontline Club. My name's Vin Ray. I'm from the BBC College of Journalism. This session is one of a series where we are asking leading journalists to look back on the seminal moments in their own careers and at some of their influences. And in doing so, hopefully, give us some insights into the craft and practice of journalism. The format for the evening is we're going to show some clips, we're going to have some discussion, and then we'll throw it open to a Q&A at the end. It's sort of a conflation of This Is Your Life, Desert Island Discs in the informal surroundings of the Frontline Club.
You didn't tell me that before I came.
Our guest this evening is one of the world's leading news executives, or at least today he is. I'm not sure whether tomorrow he will be. When's the formal date? We'll come to that in a moment. He started his career as a trainee journalist with Thompson Regional Newspapers, working with Celtic Press in the Welsh Valleys, and then the South Wales Echo. In 1980, he joined the BBC as sub-editor in the radio newsroom, and he's gone on to the most extraordinary range of roles in the BBC. He edited hundreds of programmes, mostly on the 9 o'clock news, I think. He's been the BBC's news editor, head of news gathering, director of news. He even had a brief interregnum as the director of sport for a while. And in the next couple of days, he's standing down as director of the global division and leaving the BBC. In fact, he's leaving do is tomorrow night. He is, of course, and please welcome Richard Sambrook. So, Richard, that's an extraordinary range of jobs that you've done. Secretly, is there anything that you wish you'd done that you haven't?
I always, it's not really that big a range, it's all news, isn't it? I mean, I think I wasn't head of comedy or anything fun like that. The job I always said I wanted was the one you did, which was foreign editor. And I never got to be foreign editor because I kind of went round it via news editor and other things and all the rest of it. But as we'll probably see through some of these clips, you know, international news has always been what's really motivated me and all the rest of it, and I've always thought that being foreign editor, or world news editor as we now call it at the BBC, has got to be one of the great jobs in journalism for sure. So
well, that's cheered me up for the okay, when did you let's go back to when you were a teenager, maybe, I'm not sure, but when did you first know you wanted to be a journalist?
Well, I don't think I really knew I wanted to be a journalist until I was getting ready to leave university and looked at what the alternatives were. And I went to the careers department and said, what do you do with an English degree? And they said, teaching or town planning. And I didn't fancy either of those. And I said, what about journalism? And they said, forget it, it's far too competitive. And I thought, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And I went for the newspaper training course and got on it. But I remember, in hindsight, I was always, you know, I used to love watching, don't laugh about this, I used to love watching Alan Wicker. And actually, when they replayed some of those Wicker Worlds recently, they were fantastically well written. And you know, his Papa Doc documentary, obviously, but even the travelogue stuff, you know, incredibly well written and great piece of television journalism in many ways. But particularly things like James Cameron, you know, who was obviously mainly a newspaper journalist and foreign correspondent, but you know, he did a lot of kind of documentaries for the BBC and authored stuff and all the rest of it. And I was always thoroughly kind of immersed in all of that. So, and you know, watched the news and so on. So I suppose it shouldn't have been too much of a surprise that I decided to go in that direction.
So you got onto this trainee scheme, and what were your first jobs in the scheme?
Oh, you know, council meetings and golden weddings and magistrate courts and all that usual stuff, you know, yeah.
But what did you learn at that time? What did it teach you?
That if you didn't get it absolutely right, they'd harangue you in the street or in the pub, and you know, you absolutely were living amongst your audience. And I suppose, you know, we now talk about audience focus and focus groups and audience research and all the rest of it, but when you're on a local newspaper, it's your next door neighbour and, you know, the guy you see tomorrow and so on. So absolutely understanding that news is about people and it's important to get it right and to be, you know, fair and all the rest of it.
So, is that the only point in your career when you've been a reporter?
Yeah, I gave up reporting when I went from print to broadcasting, yeah. And some people would say the reasons are obvious, but...
I didn't say that. Okay. Who else were your journalistic heroes in those days? You mentioned Alan Wicker, print or broadcast.
Yeah, and I said James Cameron and so on. I mean, I think, you know, we're coming up to one of the first clips maybe, because I distinctly remember I guess I would still have been at school just about. I'm trying to think what year it would have been, but Vietnam and the fall of Saigon. And the first clip we're going to see is of one of the correspondents who, you know, I remember watching then, but I never dreamed that I would get to work with and even become a friend of in the years to come, and that's Brian Barron reporting the fall of Saigon. And Brian was, I mean, he died sadly last year, but he was a fantastic guy. And for me, he was watching at home, you know, as a teenager, the kind of quintessential foreign correspondent for me. But when I got to know him, he was just a fantastic guy to work with, and you know, he was unflappable. You know, he of course had a huge ego, because they all do, but it never got in the way. He was incredibly easy to deal with, and I would have trusted him with my life, which is not true of many of his colleagues. And he always managed to give that twist of insight, which gave extra value, you know, and he was 100% reliable. And obviously Brian and Eric Thyres Cameron were just one of the kind of legendary teams of news.
Okay.
The last helicopter came in for a handful of US Marines, a humiliating end to the American presence. 1 mile away outside our hotel, the final disintegration of law and order was taking place. Groups of looters began straggling past with goods stolen from abandoned American quarters. We tried to show our neutrality, the fact that we were not Americans, by fixing a Union Jack to our hired car. Most Vietnamese were fully engaged in plunder. To 9 on the morning of the final American departure. The last Americans left the embassy complex about 25 minutes ago, and the fate of the embassy is very clear. It's now being systematically looted from floor to floor, and part of the building has been set on fire.
It's great to see, and I mean the story behind that is the classic one of you know, Brian was there to report what was happening, and once they knew the city was going, he was ordered out for safety, and of course refused to go because, as he said, what foreign correspondent will walk out on the biggest story of his life? And you know, it was the story that made him, really. But he didn't look any different 30 years later than he did doing that, in my view.
Except for the safari suit.
Yeah. I suspect it was still in his cupboard somewhere.
Okay, so you left the South Wales Echo and made your way to London to the BBC radio newsroom, is that right? And so paint us a portrait of the BBC radio newsroom in 1980.
Trying to look around, see if there's anyone here who was there at the time. There may be one or two. I used to top and tail Williams reports. I can remember that very well. It was a place of... it was very funny. There were a lot of very genuinely amusing, but also some quite strange people there. They smoked. You went out to the pub after the 1 o'clock news till about 2:30, and then you went out to the pub again at 6:30 till about 7:30 or 8, and then after the 10 o'clock news you went down to the pub again. And it was the clatter of typewriters, no computers, and journalists never touched typewriters. They dictated to typists. Because we were gentlemen journalists, obviously, and you weren't.
Sparks, I would imagine.
Yeah, exactly. And you weren't allowed to edit your own quarter-inch tape or anything. You had, you know, SMs had to do that, and journalists weren't allowed to do that. So we didn't do a lot, really. We kind of sat there and, you know, rewrote bits of agency copy and tops and tailed Williams reports. But it was a lot of, yeah, it was a lot of fun. To be honest with you, I did learn a lot there about basic kind of editorial discipline and how you put a story together and working with sources, and you know, it was much stricter in terms of, you know, identifying how you'd put a piece together and how you'd put the sources together and all the rest of it than it is these days. So you kind of learn a lot of kind of basic journalistic disciplines that way.
What made you want to move across to television?
Well, why wouldn't you, really, was my view. I mean, at least to go and, I mean, to radio is fantastic, but if
there is a view in radio that it's the senior service and it's all rather shallow.
Well, that's true, and I don't think it's either or, but if you're in the BBC and you're 24, why would you not want to go and try television? So, I mean, I went across to television on an attachment, and if I'd hated it, I'd have been very happy to come back to radio, and radio in all sorts of ways has many advantages over television, but television gets the big audiences, it's where the resources were, and you had pictures to play with. It's great fun, you know, particularly if you're in the production side. I personally think if I'd ever been a reporter, I might have stayed in radio, because you can control the product far easier, and television is a team, you know, always a team activity. But as a producer, you really had, you know, a much bigger role to play in television.
So you went across as a producer, and then was that on the 9 o'clock news, or was that?
It was just in the general newsroom.
And then you made your way to the 9 o'clock news and started editing the programme.
Yeah.
And that's where this next. I want to introduce this next.
So in November 1989, I was editing the 9 o'clock news, and about just after 7, I think, as I remember it, there was a bit of Reuters that fell from this news conference that had been going on in East Berlin, saying that they were going to open the wall. And it was one of those moments, you know, we had the programme sorted out, and that hardly figured on the running order. And it was one of those moments where either this was the biggest story of your career, or Reuters had made the most monumental fuck-up. And it was obviously the former, as it turned out. And you had to remake the whole programme in kind of less than 90 minutes and try and find a way of reflecting, you know, the scale of what was absolutely clearly a big moment in history. And I remember, as he's not here, I'll tell the story. John Simpson was in Poland with coal, and I rang him and said, John, you know, I know you filed your report at 6 o'clock, but the Berlin Wall's coming down. You know, you're with the Germans, and you're going to need to recut it. And he said, no, I don't think so. It's not. That's really not what my story's about, you know. So I said, oh, well, okay, then you're dropped, you know, because there's no way I can run a report about the German without mentioning the fact the wall's come down. So the phone went down for about, not quite 5 minutes, I think, before they go. I mean, maybe I can possibly just turn it around, old boy, you know. So anyway, you ran a bit of John Simpson. And the following day, I flew out to Berlin. Well, overnight, we chartered and went out to Berlin, and I was there for about 6 weeks, and I remember kind of producing the coverage from the west side. But that night, Brian Hanran was already in East Berlin and filed this kind of now very kind of familiar report from overnight on that first night in the Berlin Wall.
Checkpoint Charlie was open, and they were through, called on by the delighted West Berliners waiting on the other side. This did not look like a planned move from the communist authorities, but rather another panicked response by a government giving way to the parliament of the streets. Others clambered playfully up and down on the Berlin Wall itself, something people used to be shot for. And with nobody to stop them, it wasn't long before the first attempts were made to destroy the structure itself. Everybody was testing how far they could stretch their new freedoms. Standing on top of the Berlin Wall, which for years has been the most potent symbol of the division of Europe, and there can be few better illustrations of the changes which are sweeping across this continent than the party which is taking place here on top of it tonight.
So, yeah, just one of those fantastic moments of, you know, privileged moment of history, really, for you to be part of and witnessing and so on. And as I said, I was out there for about between 4 and 6 weeks, I think, just trying to find, you know, every day. I mean, I'm trying to think. There was John Simpson was there again, and Ben Brown and Mike Smart and Brian on the east, and trying to find ways to convey the scale of what was happening and what it would mean for Germany and what it would mean for Europe, but also what it meant for families, and, you know, looking for every single kind of angle and level that you could. And then, of course, after that came Prague, and then Budapest, and then Romania, and on it went. But, you know, in the end, it doesn't get any better than being present at a moment of history like that and having a part to play in trying to explain it and report it.
So the following sort of revolutions around Europe, you covered as you were editing the programmes. Mm-hmm. Having edited so many programmes, what is the art of being a good editor? What is a good programme editor?
I think it's about editorial confidence, really. And I think if you're in an organisation like the BBC, you have the luxury of actually, you can be lazy if you want, because you could come in as a programme editor in news, and you could probably still do it today, and news gathering will provide enough material and enough reports to fill 30 minutes. You don't actually have to do anything except put them in the right order if you want to, and actually most people will probably think, well, that's fine. But when you push it and you stretch it and you say, no, I don't want that, I want to do something different, and I want a different angle, and I want to, to have the confidence to go away from the diary and go away from what everyone else is doing, it's always better. And I used to say to people, what's different about the fact that you came to work today? If you hadn't been here, the fact that you came here, what difference did you make? Because if you didn't make any difference, there's no point turning up. And I think that's quite a good gauge, particularly for an editor. What did you add? What did you bring to it? What did you change? And what was different as a consequence of you doing it? So always kind of pushing away at trying to do something different and being more ambitious and more aspirational about what you're doing is an important part. But that takes an editorial confidence to do it, because it can be quite exposed sometimes. I remember must have been in 91 or 92, the Kurds, after the First Iraq War, on the Kurds. And there was a story about the refugees, and actually no one else was doing it very much, and I just decided to go nap on that story. And it was quite difficult to get material and pictures and all the rest of it. We managed to put together about 15 minutes of material on what was happening, and of course everything else then follows behind you. If you take the risk and you commit yourself editorially and you say, I think this is a really important story and we're really going to say we think this is important because, and you go with it, then people will come in behind you and you can make a difference editorially, and that's the point of doing the job, really.
You started moving into senior leadership after the 9 o'clock news. Who inspired you as a leader? Who had you worked for that had inspired you?
I suppose I'd say 2 or 3 people, and for very different reasons. Ron Neal inspired me when I first went across to television, and Ron was the editor of the 6 o'clock news. He'd been brought in from Current Affairs to edit the 6 o'clock news, and then quickly was made editor of all of television news. And he still is an inspiring figure. Not everybody gets on with him and likes him, but Ron absolutely revolutionised television news in the BBC. We were being thrashed by ITN at the time, and Ron came in and turned it upside down. And it was, I was very lucky to come in at that moment and be part of that. And it was a very kind of innovative and creative time where if you wanted to take risks and you committed yourself to trying to improve things and do things differently, he would back you. And so Ron was very inspirational. He was, a people person, and he would back you. And if he knew you were on side and what you were trying to do, he'd give you the space to do it. And so he was definitely inspirational. In a very different way, Chris Kramer, who will raise some smiles around the room. But Chris is still a very good friend of mine. I love Chris, and he is his bark is worse than his bite. But he was very clear, in terms of strong leadership. We were never in any doubt with Chris about where you stood and what he wanted. And that business of he was always ahead of you in terms of what was happening with the story and what should be happening on the desk. Somehow he was always ahead of you. When I was news editor, Chris would ring me at 3 in the morning and simply say, "Who have you sent?" And you'd think, "Oh shit, something's happened. He knows about it and I don't." Who have you sent? Okay, what is it? But just that real hard competitiveness and drive that Chris had was definitely inspiring.
Let's move on to the next piece, which I'll introduce. This is Martin Bell in Bosnia. Why did you choose this?
2 or 3 reasons, really. I mean, Bosnia and all of those Balkan wars in the 90s were a hugely important set of issues and stories for us through the 90s. Very dangerous. As a post-war conflict, it was the first kind of significant post-war conflict where I think the risk for journalists rose very, very swiftly and exponentially. And that's when we started to get into safety training and equipment and flak jackets and all the rest of it came in for Bosnia. The BBC to the cost of, I suspect, viewing figures, stuck with the story and invested heavily in the story. So we said, we don't care if people don't really understand the Balkans or are bored with hearing it night after night. This is a really significant civil war in Europe, and you need to know about it, and we're going to go very heavily in reporting it. And I think that was a very important commitment for the BBC to make. Martin, of course, defined that Balkans reporting in many ways, and his personal commitment to it was extraordinary. And this particular piece is a really good example of his reporting, but also the piece to camera in it. There's a lot of debate, we might pick this up after the clip, about the use of violent images and how much you can show on screen, how much you can't. This is a really good example of properly reporting a horrific incident without having to show really gruesome images, but still conveying the shock and awfulness of what had happened.
Okay.
The British then took their patrol through Ahenici, where the worst of these atrocities was alleged to have occurred. This is or was a Muslim village of some 400 people. Every one of the Muslim houses was burnt to the ground. Down the road, the fallen minaret was the very symbol of ethnic cleansing. The infantry then went on a foot patrol to look for more casualties or evidence of atrocities. They didn't have far to search. They came upon a house in the center of the village where a family of 7 had died, 2 in the stairway, another 5 in the cellar. It's hard to look at some of these pictures, harder to tell the story of Ahenici without them. What happened here can frankly not be shown in any detail, but the room is full of the charred remains of bodies, and they died in the greatest agony. It's hard to imagine, in our continent and in our time, what kind of people could do this.
It looks like the father and the son try to defend the mother and the daughters, the mother and the daughters being in the cellars. The father and the son possibly shot and then burnt upstairs, and then someone has deliberately set fire to the cellar, and all the mother and possibly the daughters and the young children have all died, 5 or 6 in the cellar. It is quite horrifying. Down in the village, the colonel then met a patrol of the HVO, the local Croatian army. It was a tense encounter.
Do you have the permission of HVO?
I don't need the permission of the bloody HVO.
Meni ne treba dozvola.
I am from the United Nations.
Ja sam iz Ujedinjenih nacija.
And as far as I'm concerned, what has happened here is disgraceful.
I ono što se mene tiče,
Bad luck, my
se ovdje
friend.
desilo je užasno.
You know, there are whole families up here that have been massacred. I'd like to know who's done it.
Porodice su gore koje su masakrirane I volio bi da znam ko je to uradio.
Who has done it? Who is responsible?
Ko je odgovoran za ovo?
It's not you, obviously, is it?
The Croats drove away. A more welcome guest was Jean-Pierre Thébault, head of the European Community monitoring team here.
Absolutely a shame.
I just had the HVO telling me no cameras. I told them to get stuffed.
For the cameras, yeah.
For the cameras, yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's a paradox about Martin, isn't there? That is the most brilliant example of how to do it without showing graphic imagery. And yet Martin is the person who has led the charge in saying we glamorize war by showing the sort of bang-bang of the shells going into the city, but we don't really show the damage that the shells are doing and the human cost of them when they arrive there. I mean, do you think he's right?
I don't think it's straightforward. So, I mean, I think, well, firstly, I can understand that correspondents or anybody working in those circumstances feels really strongly about showing the full horror of what's taken place, and I absolutely understand and sympathise with that. Equally, as broadcasters, we have a responsibility for what goes into people's living rooms at 6 o'clock in the evening with kids gathered around the set and all the rest of it. And the question is, do you need to show the really horrific and graphic imagery to be able to properly convey what has taken place? And I think that's quite a good example of how, you know, you can do it without showing the most awful images. On the other hand, I think we sometimes got it wrong. I think in the 2003 Iraq war we over-sanitized, if I'm honest. But it's a very difficult judgment to get right. And if you're in the field and in the eye of it, you will have very strong feelings about it, but that may not be the judgment that has to carry. Equally, if you're in London, you know, it's very easy to get wrapped up in the kind of policy issues without really feeling the full emotion of what's taking place on the ground, and somehow you have to have a relationship with the correspondent, the picture editor and the camera team and all the rest of it that gets that balance right. I remember talking to Ian Pritchard, I think it was, in the first Gulf War in the, what was it called, you know, the alleyway where they all got shot at.
Pass.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I can't remember who was with Ian. Who was it?
Sue Stein.
Sue Stein. And Sue said she could see that Ian was shooting for broadcast. In other words, he wasn't taking pictures of the most graphic, you know, horrific images. So she decided to shoot for history. And said, this needs to be captured somehow, whether it gets used or not, it needs to be captured. I think I got that the right way around. And of course that's right, you know, but there are judgments that have to be made about it. The other thing about that piece is, Martin, of course, went on to talk about a journalism of attachment.
I was going to ask you about that.
And you know, said he felt that we were, again, another sense of sanitising by trying to be impartial and trying not to come down on sides. That was a perfect example of journalism of attachment in a way. That wasn't a question of the BBC being biased one way or the other, but it was a moral commitment to what had, you know, the horror of what had taken on the ground. And it's not a question of political bias or side or the rest of it, but there could be a moral commitment to what had taken place. And I think that's absolutely fine. But, you know, Martin was one of the most skilled correspondents in the world. Not everybody can do it.
So you don't think that the journalism of attachment, as he described it, because that was taken by a lot of people to mean stop being impartial.
I think even Martin may have meant stop being impartial at some point. I think, you know, we have to be incredibly careful when you start saying we're going to take sides. But I think there is a kind of moral case that you can make, and in the case of a massacre or genocide, as we're going on to now, you know, that moral commitment is absolutely right and proper.
There was a massive survey done recently of global brands by your future employer, I think, actually, and concluded one of the results was that Fox was the most trusted broadcaster in America. Do you think that's going to come to this country?
I hope not. I mean, part of the reason for that, even some Democrats trusted Fox because they knew what they were going to get. In other words, the bias was transparent. So even if they disagreed with it, they could kind of trust that Fox was going to be, you know, off the scale in one direction.
People not trust the BBC on that basis?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why we've had to get into, you know, as I say, you have to explain the judgments behind the news now. It's not enough. The journalism in itself is not enough to automatically earn trust anymore. Transparency, you know, there's a phrase, David Weinberger, an American academic, has this phrase that transparency is the new objectivity. You know, objectivity was the means of people trusting the news because we're going to try and be fair, we're not going to be biased, we're going to have, you know, a point of view from all sides, and that was why people should trust us in a simpler world. Well, the world's a lot more complicated than that now, and although an organisation like the BBC still has to be objective, but transparency, being completely open about what you've got and why you've arrived at a particular decision, is the new means of engendering trust. And I think, you know, journalism in general, and particularly broadcast journalism, and an organisation like the BBC has still got a long way to go to be more transparent and open about the basis on which we make editorial judgments. But that is why people will trust us in the end, if they feel we're being completely open with them.
What would it look like if it was more transparent? Is that something in the journalism, or is it things besides the journalism which open up the organisation itself?
I think it's a couple of things. I think we've gone down a long way, and actually this is something that has happened in my time here really, in terms of correspondent two ways and pieces to camera and making professional judgments and allowing correspondents to make professional judgments on air. Now, professional judgments are different from personal opinions, but you can only get away with making a professional judgment if you can bring the evidence, show the evidence of why you've arrived at that judgment. So it's not good enough for a correspondent to say, I think X will happen. It has to be, I think X will happen because this, this and this. You know, and then people will get it. So I mean, I think it has to be evidence-based journalism, and then on the other hand, for those people who want it, I think you can provide editors, blogs, or whatever you want in order to try and lay it out there. If people still want to pursue it and discuss it and so on, you can provide the means to allow them to do it. And if you don't If you don't, you appear closed and defensive.
But going back to my original question, do you think it's likely that, I suppose it will be Ofcom relaxes the rules on impartiality in this country?
Well, there's a lot of kind of talk about it, and I guess it may happen at some stage. But I personally think that the reason that Britain, I still believe, leads the world in terms of broadcast news is because of the impartiality regulation, and that's what's driven up the standards here. And I think as soon as you start to relax that, then I think it's the thin end of a very large wedge. So my personal hope is that they don't relax that. But there's a lot of discussion about saying, actually, can't we all be, mature and grown up, and everyone say where they're coming from, and all the rest of it. I think that's a really bad idea, because it'll just get the news that the money can buy.
Okay, let's look at our next piece.
Fergal reporting from Rwanda in 1994. I think it's best. Why don't we just play the piece and talk about it afterwards?
As we approached the church at Nyarabuye, Frank became silent. He had been here before and knew what lay ahead. I had seen war before, had seen the face of cruelty, but Nyarabuye belonged in a nightmare zone, where my capacity to understand, to rationalize, was overwhelmed. The victims, all of them Tutsis, had gone to the church in search of sanctuary. Instead, the house of God became a killing ground. You don't just see death here, you feel it and you smell it. It is as if all the good and life in the atmosphere had been sucked out and replaced with the stench of evil. There are two thoughts then, that of the people who knew they were going to die and the mortal terror they must have felt, and of the savagery and hatred in the hearts of those who were going to kill them.
So, I mean, again, another incredibly important story in the 90s. That it was just, not going to be a kind of, popular viewer-raising issue, but it was just incredibly important that we covered it. Fergal, who is a great reporter, I mean, just the power of his script and the pictures and all the rest of it. But the real importance to that is the importance of bearing witness. And in the end, I just think that's at the core of the importance of journalism, really, is, people have to go and bear witness. You have to be there and you have to see it, and you have to have people who are prepared to say, no, I've been there and I've seen it, and who will mediate that for a general audience. And, that's a fantastically strong example of that.
Do you, when we started the College of Journalism, we did a huge survey of BBC journalists. And one of the interesting things that came back is that a lot of people didn't consider themselves to be journalists, and I think it was something to do with not getting out of the building and processing material. Really, does that ring true to you, and does that worry you?
It does worry me. Yeah, I mean, that was from a panorama, and obviously you got Fergal and the cameraman, but the editor and the producer, and particularly the picture editor, contribute as much to it in providing a fantastically important panorama film. But I also say to people who used to say that to me when I was in news, we're on News 24 or whatever, it's kind of news processing. Of course that's true, but you are still writing a script that is received by millions of people, and it comes back to what I was saying before. You can just cut and paste a bit of PA if you want. But actually, even if you only take a few minutes trouble to try and craft a script, every word you write is heard, or everything is watched, or whatever it may be, read by millions of people, and that is a fantastically important thing. And I think it's quite easy when you're working in a news organisation to kind of lose sight and lose that connection with the audience. But it is, really quite a profound thing. And I'd say anybody who is in involved in producing output that is consumed by millions of people, you know, they are journalists if they're working in news, and they need to think about it and care about it.
You say something about the expansion of news gathering under your tenure, because in your time in that department, I mean, at the beginning, you were saying to me that there were very, very few foreign bureau with any television capability at all.
I think we worked out that in the beginning of the 90s, when you and I went into news gathering, there were, I think, 6 foreign bureau that were TV capable, and none TV capable in Europe. And then by the end of the 90s, I mean, overall we had, whatever the figure was, 45 bureau. Now, not all of those were TV capable, but we were certainly into the kind of dozens that were TV capable, and we had SNG and we had live coverage by that stage. And, you know, it was a very fortunate period for those of us who were involved in it, because there was a conscious decision by the BBC to invest in news gathering. And, you know, we had this big expansion of resource into Foreign Bureau, big expansion in terms of live capacity and live capability, a big expansion of putting production alongside specialism and production into the field. And, you know, I think it did transform it, and, you know, it seems to kind of wax and wane and so on, but I think at the end of the 90s, the BBC unquestionably had the most powerful news gathering operation in the world. And that was because, you know, people slag off John Burt, but he took the decision to put the money in there because he recognised that's what counted and was going to count in the years ahead in the context of 24-hour news.
Okay, should we have a look at the next clip?
Yeah.
Now, for the latest from Afghanistan, the BBC's World Affairs editor, John Simpson, is on the front line, not far from the capital, Kabul. He joins us now. John, what do the Northern Alliance plan to do next?
Well, planning and reality are, I think, probably going to be two different things. I think they plan still, at least the political leaders, to stop at what they call the gates of Kabul. They've been promising that for a month or so now. But when you talk to the military leaders on the ground, to the ordinary soldiers, they just want to get into Kabul. And unless things have been changed by this overnight halt and the opportunity to put on a bit of pressure and think again, which is a possibility, otherwise I think when everybody wakes up here in just a few hours' time, they're just going to walk into their city.
It's interesting you say that, because we talked to the Foreign Secretary earlier this evening, and he seemed unprepared for the eventuality that they might do that. He said he thought the Northern Alliance would see that it was in their own interest to cooperate with the International Alliance and its strategy for a broad-based coalition in Kabul.
Well, Foreign Secretaries in London are an awful long way away from Kabul itself.
Yeah, and obviously for the alliance it would be very embarrassing if the Northern Alliance were to go in, but even more so it would be embarrassing if any human rights abuses, any massacres, any revenge attacks happened as a consequence of that. What's the mood of those troops? Do you think that they would act responsibly if they were to enter Kabul?
I think they would, yes. I mean, it depends really, I think, on what the Taliban do if they escape from the city, which is what most of the Northern Alliance people think is likely. If they leave an empty city, then I don't think there'll be any scope for that kind of revenge killing. After all, that's what happened in Mazar-e-Sharif only 2 days ago now. There weren't any retributions, any great retributions carried out there. And I think that in Kabul it'll be the same. I mean, I'm sure there'll be people who've been mistreated on a small scale, and some perhaps murdered, but I don't think it'd be a very sizable thing if the Taliban get out, which has, I think, always been the intention on the part of the Northern Alliance, at least to allow them to escape perhaps to the city of Jalalabad in the east and Kandahar in the south.
So, a number of things to say about that, really. I mean, firstly, we wanted an example of 24-hour news, because that's, as we were just saying before, was one of the huge shifts, you know, and it's quite hard to take on now, really, how, you know, 15 years ago, the BBC was offering people news at 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and if you wanted to know what had happened in the world, you had to sit down at 6 o'clock or 9 o'clock, and we would tell them what we thought they needed to know. Now, that world's been blown apart completely by 24-hour news and the internet and all the rest of it. And you know, you can see Carrie, who you know, I think is a fantastic presenter. I love Carrie, but she's desperately trying to fill because they've got this link up and they're going to make the most of it, and they've got to stretch it out. And can I think of another question? And you know, the rest of it. On the other hand, you've got Simpson, who again, it comes to that bearing witness point, and you know, he can put Whitehall back in its box because he's there and they're not, and you know, he is you know, pretty well informed about what's going on and can make a specialist judgment about what's likely to happen the next day. And I think that was the night before he then went and liberated Kabul, probably. So, you know, which, whatever you think about it, it was fantastic to have him there. And so you know, it's a mixture of 24-hour news, the impact of having specialist coverage, and again, that business about the importance of people on the ground.
But do you, so what was, News 24 was 1997 launched, along with the website, I think, actually.
Yeah.
And which changed the metabolism of news completely. It's now a 24-hour news cycle. I mean, a lot of people will say there is no time to reflect anymore. You end up going up on the hour, repeating yourself and trying to fill airtime. I mean, do you have sympathy with that, or?
I do, yeah, and I think it's, you know, I have sympathy all round. I have sympathy for the correspondents on the ground who don't have time to go and do any journalism because they've just got to talk to the camera. I have sympathy for the programme editors who've got all this time to fill. In the end, you know, 24-hour news is dictated by resources which are never quite as much as we like to pretend they are. And that's why you get the same 20 minutes again, because we actually don't have the resources to find a different 20 minutes quite often, you know. But if you've got specialism and you've got good editors and all the rest of it, then, you know, you can make a very, you know, powerful contribution, particularly on moving news and breaking news.
From a news gathering perspective, there's an extraordinary story behind how
I'll tell you two. I know the one you're coming to. Just before that, you mentioned the launch of the website in 1997. I just remembered this. John Burt wanted to launch the website, and we kind of knew vaguely what a website was, and he gave us the money to do it. And we found some people who knew how to do it and did it actually remarkably well. But he rang me the day before it was about to be unveiled and launched and said, Richard, this will be updated quite regularly, won't it? It's not just going to be like it once a day. And I said, absolutely, John, it's going to be updated constantly. And put the phone down and rang Bob Eggington and said, this thing is going to be updated, Bob. Oh, yes, absolutely. So thankfully they'd already thought of that, so that was all right.
Just a bit, the fantastic story about that website is that there was a reporter called Mike Smart, fantastic guy, and he had a Scion organizer. And so everyone thought, well, he knows about computers. And they asked him to start up the website because he had a Scion organizer.
We sent him off. I sent him off on a tape. I said, there's this thing called launch. Go and find out how we can do one, Mike. And he said, oh, OK, yeah. And did a fantastic job.
And then there was the heroic. Were you going to tell the heroic story of?
Well, I don't know a lot of people here know it, but I mean when Simpson liberated Kabul, you know, swiftly after that he was up live from Kabul, and I went to the foreign desk and said, congratulations, fantastic to get the live link up, you know, get the dish in there. How on earth did you get the dish there so fast? And the person on the foreign desk looked rather sheepish and said, oh, I'm sorry, it was just, you know, really a bit of a cock-up and, you know, nearly didn't happen. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, you know, they were driving in from the north, whatever it was, and, you know, the lorry could only get so far because of the snow. So they had to take the dish off and break it down into 30 pieces and rent a pack of mules and load it on the mules and trek for 3 days through the snow in the Hindu Kush. And they only just got to Kabul and managed to reassemble it in time. I'm really sorry, it was so close. And he just thought, that is just such a fantastic, incredible story. And of course, it was later used in promos to puff the BBC and all the rest of it, you know. But it's just a brilliant illustration of the kind of commitment of, you know, the people who never get on camera and you never hear about, and the sat engineers and the technicians that make all of this happen, and they are the most fantastic people and the bravest and most resourceful people you could ever meet.
And the fixers as well.
And the fixers, yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to move on to another panorama, I think. And this one, I think this is 2003, I think. It's John Ware.
Yeah, I think it's 2001.
2001, is it? Okay, so it's John Ware looking back at what happened at Omar in the bombings.
Daly was obviously expecting cameras. We knew Seamus Daly was in the house. His mobile was lying on the table, but he was lying low.
Mr. Daly? My name is John Ware and I work for the BBC Panorama programme, and I'd like to ask you some questions, please, about the Omagh bombing. I know that you're in the house because your van is here. One thing I'd like you to explain, Mr. Daly, please, is how you came to be in possession of a mobile telephone which was located in the Omagh area at about the time that the bomb car was parked. I'd also like you to explain, please, how your own personal mobile telephone came to be linked to another bombing, Lisbon, which led up to the Omagh bombing. Mr. Daly, I know that you're in the house, and I do think you owe the families of Omagh an explanation for the questions I have asked you.
But Seamus Daly stayed behind his front door, so I decided to try to talk to him on the telephone.
I've just dialed the Daly home number. Number busy.
It seems that Daly was summoning reinforcements. The local police informed us that minutes after we left, a posse of his brothers and friends arrived. Through his lawyer, Mr. Daly has since denied any part in the Omagh bombing.
Why did you choose that picture?
Lots of reasons. I mean, firstly, it's just such a fantastically brave.
The government's facing more questions than.
A fantastically brave and brilliant piece of reporting and investigation, and you know that's the kind of investigative current affairs journalism that's just so important for us to try to protect, and it's very difficult for all sorts of reasons in terms of budgets and schedules, and you know trying to kind of justify it and so on. But absolutely outstanding piece of investigative journalism, and John Ware is one of the great investigative journalists. I'm a huge fan.
People have been commentators have been talking about the death of investigative journalism for some time now. Do you buy that argument, or are you still hearing and seeing enough?
I still see and hear some good investigative journalism. I think it's getting more difficult to see that kind of commitment on BBC One, or certainly you don't see it on ITV or even Channel 4 that much anymore. And Panorama's now 30 minutes. That's just not a criticism of the current programme team. They're doing some great programmes, but it's not the same. I think I'm right in saying that was an hour special in prime time at 9 o'clock. I'm not sure you'd get that today.
There were some really big and interesting safety issues in the making of that programme, and you've been very heavily involved in safety in all sorts of ways during your career, particularly since you were in news gathering. Where are we now with safety? We had you mentioned the kind of first armoured vehicles and flak jackets in Bosnia in the early 90s. Then we had John Schofield's death, which led to a kind of industry of training and so on and so forth. Where are we now with it?
Okay, I think in terms of the importance and the kind of shape and framework of training, hostile environment training, that's pretty well established, and there's some very good firms, and there's a pretty broad commitment to it, particularly in broadcast, much less so in print. And in terms of the kind of kit and support that's appropriate and how people should work in the field, I think again we've got a very good kind of basis there for providing the right kind of support. Training, I mean, the whole safety issues kind of moving on now into the more psychological area, really, which again is, I remember when we first started to say we want people to wear helmets and flak jackets and we want to provide an armoured car, there was a pushback from the teams in the field. We don't need them, we don't want them, they're not necessary, and all the rest of it. But actually, we managed to change that culture, I think, and rightly so. As soon as you start to talk about post-traumatic stress, you get the same pushback. No, we don't need that, I'm fine, and all the rest of it. But actually, we put people, and you've seen some of these stories already, we put people through the most extraordinary experiences, and it absolutely has a real impact on them, and we have a responsibility to support them and help them and deal with the impact of those kind of experiences that it can have, doesn't have on everybody, but can have on people. And I think we have a real responsibility. So it's moving more into that kind of realm now. the overall need for it is growing, not getting less. You know, it's 2 journalists a week get killed somewhere in the world doing their job. Most of them are not the kind of Fergals or the John Simpsons or the, you know, whoever, you know, international journalists and so on. It's local journalists investigating corruption or politics in their own country, and therefore, you know, as an industry, and particularly for an organisation like the BBC is a big player in the industry, I think we have a responsibility in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of the press to lobby and to work hard for the protection of journalists, but also to try and ensure that, you know, there is an end to impunity and that governments and international bodies live up to their commitment in terms of free speech and freedom of the press.
Okay. We're going to look at an interesting episode in your career now. The date is the 29th of May 2003. The time is 7 minutes past 6 in the morning. The programme is the Today programme, and the reporter is Andrew Gilligan. Let's have a listen to the two-way.
This morning over its claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Our defence correspondent is Andrew Gilligan. This in particular, Andy, is Tony Blair saying they'd be ready to go within 45 minutes.
That's right. That was a central claim in his dossier, which he published in September, the main case, if you like, against Iraq, and the main statement of the British government's belief of what it thought Iraq was up to. And what we've been told by one of the senior officials in charge of drawing up that dossier was that actually the government probably knew that 45-minute figure was wrong even before it decided to put it in. What this person says is that a week before the publication date of the dossier, it was actually rather a bland production. It didn't, the draft prepared for Mr. Blair by the intelligence agencies actually didn't say very much more than was public knowledge already. And Downing Street, our source says, ordered a week before publication, ordered it to be sexed up, to be made more exciting, and ordered more facts to be discovered.
What we didn't hear there was John Humphreys afterwards saying, "We're going to. I suspect we're going to hear more about that." It had profound implications, obviously. But what was wrong with that broadcast?
It wasn't a very good piece of broadcasting because he's sitting at home on an ISDN down and hardly awake. Actually, in terms of the script, from what we know now, there isn't anything wrong with it. It was entirely accurate, and I could defend every word of that. The problem was that he didn't have the grounds for being able to defend it when it came under pressure. He didn't have the notes, he didn't have the evidence hard enough to be able to stand behind it. And there were also subsequent problems in the way that he and the programme handled it. There was the problem of him writing a personal attack on Alistair Campbell in the newspapers, all sorts of issues that followed out from that. But in terms of the story, that is what David Kelly said, that is what David Kelly believed, and we know from the documentation that's come out, much of it since Hutton, to be honest with you, that actually he had good grounds for saying it. So, in terms of that story, I would say it was right, but I'd say the journalism around it was too sloppy and not sufficiently disciplined to be able to really stand up to the kind of pressure and scrutiny it subsequently came under.
Okay, I'm sure people are going to want to ask you questions about this afterwards. But there's a couple of other things I'd like. Just on the day the Hutton report was published, just talk us through the day. And I'm very interested to know, where were you and how was it?
Gosh, okay.
It was rumoured. I think. Did you know the day before how bad it was going to be?
Yeah. So we got sight of it the day before. Yeah. And it was far worse than we had kind of hoped or expected it to be. So I stayed up in town that night, and it was the first. There were 3 nights. I got absolutely no sleep at all. Because I didn't sleep last night, and what that means is I got 4 hours. I got absolutely no sleep at all. Went into the office at about I don't know, 7 or 8 p.m. and a.m. and there's a whole wall of photographers you had to walk through and all the rest of it. To be honest with you, I don't remember the detail of what was happening except a kind of fevered atmosphere inside the place. And then there was the kind of press conferences, and there was, as to Campbell demanding multiple resignations, and the Prime Minister kind of triumphant, PMQs. And I drove over from Broadcasting House, where Greg and Gavin Davis were, to the news centre to try and talk to the teams there about what was happening and what the BBC's position was, since this was so critical of us and all the rest of it. And on my way over, heard that Gavin had resigned, which was a shock because he didn't tell anybody. He just decided to do it and kind of went public with it before he discussed it with anyone else in the BBC. So it had started to slide, and then that night the governors met, and Greg was kind of forced into offering his resignation, expecting it to be turned down and having it accepted. And you just felt this whole thing was on the slide. And then the next day, I think it was, at that point I had my kind of resignation in my hand, not because I particularly felt I'd done anything wrong, but you could just, you could tell it was just on the slide, and there was no telling where it was going to stop. The next day I had a couple of conversations with people in the BBC, the executive board, and one of the governors, who said, we don't think you need to go. I also had a phone call from someone in government who was, at that point, they didn't work in Downing Street, but was in Downing Street and whatever was going on at that end, who sought me out and said, please don't resign because we don't want you to. And that was probably the only reason why I didn't. And then after that, it was just, what was interesting was sort of almost academically, that the organisation just had a complete vacuum at the top, and it was absolutely kind of rudderless and leaderless, and Mark Byford was kind of put in and tried to steady it and all the rest of it, but it was ferment. And then obviously the day after Greg resigned, and he was carried out shoulder high, and then the newspapers had already come out with the kind of whitewash view, and there was a sense of this backlash against that judgment, which is why I think the government said they didn't want me to resign, and they wanted to try and put a stop to it. I think they'd seen the backlash from the press, from the public, from the BBC staff, and I think genuinely thought, oh God, what have we done? What's happening here? We've got to try and steady this all down. So it was.
Just from a very personal point of view, I mean, if all the leadership manuals tell you that one of the key qualities of any top leader is resilience, and I've heard you say before that you walked around with a resignation letter in your pocket for 6 weeks. Is that right? I think I've heard you say that before. How did you get through it? I mean, because you did display, and I've heard lots of people say this, extraordinary resilience through that period to keep going. And so if you were advising someone else in a similar crisis, what would you say to them?
I'm not sure I ever felt I had a choice about what to do. I mean, I had a choice about whether to resign or not, but I felt a responsibility towards the organisation and BBC News, because I felt it was very unfair. I mean, I absolutely accepted that there were things that were wrong and they'd gone wrong on my watch, and all of that. I recognised that and accepted that. But I thought it was very unfair that the rest of news should in some way suffer because of that, because this was a very singular and very extraordinary and particular set of circumstances. And the rest of the 99% of what BBC journalism was doing was still of a higher standard and as fantastic as it's always been. And I wanted to try to get that recognised and put that right, and someone who had the overview and had the understanding of what had and hadn't happened. And I needed to get the rest of the BBC to recognise that, as well as outside the BBC. So I felt a responsibility in that sense towards the teams and the journalists and the programmes and all the rest of it.
Yeah. Just one last question on it. Just looking back now, are there one or two key moments when you now know you would have done things very differently with the benefit of hindsight?
I'm not sure there are. I mean, it was a very, very peculiar thing, and every time you thought it was dying down, something would set it alight again. But we had looked and questioned Gilligan and gone over every dot and comma that we could before making a stand and a defence. And what came out under Hutton, hadn't come out under that. And we'd had very senior editors, completely independent of the programme, going over it all and all the rest of it. So, we'd done a lot of kind of work on what had happened and what the grounds were for saying it and how solid it was. And, we knew there were problems, but we also knew that substantially there was a very important story there. And for me, in my role, it was about the independence of the BBC, because it was very clear that Alistair Campbell was trying to force us to bend to a political narrative that we knew at the time was deeply flawed and we now know to be completely wrong. And I wasn't going to do that, and it was incredibly important to make a stand for the independence of the BBC. Unfortunately, the ground on which we had to make a stand, gave way to some extent under our feet, under the scrutiny of Hutton. But I can't think of any other individual piece of journalism that's ever been subject to that kind of scrutiny. But I have no regrets about standing up for the independence of the BBC, because I think it was an unprecedented and in many ways unprincipled attack on us. I absolutely recognise there were errors and there was sloppiness and there were things that should have been done better. But I think that's for the BBC to sort out and not for other people to do.
Okay, let's move on to our next clip. We've just got a couple more to show you. So do you want to introduce this?
This is Lee's Doucette interviewing Yasser Arafat for the World Service in his bunker, and it was a long interview which I think won the Sonny Award in 2002.
You are repeating their big lies, not to lie as they are lying.
So you believe
you have to search for the accurate information. They had destroyed all our prisons, and we are putting our prisoners in flats everywhere. And you are coming to ask me these bad questions and these wrong questions. Be fair.
So you say, Yasser Arafat, Yasser Arafat, can I just ask you one last question about your hopes for the future?
Thank you. I invite you to visit me in my office in our capital, East Jerusalem, the holy, sacred city for the whole world.
And you are absolutely sure, Yasser Arafat, that you will achieve this in your lifetime, a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital?
It is not necessary for me. What is necessary is for our Palestinian people who are facing the occupation, and now they are the only people under occupation all over the world. And you are not feeling this?
They are paying a very, very heavy price, Yasser Arafat. The economy is in a mess. People's lives are being controlled, but the price is worth paying?
This is a part of our troubles. Thank you.
A lot of people wouldn't realise that Lise is probably the best known BBC figure in the world, I would imagine, she.
Yeah, well, I'd say so, and you're right. Most people, when they think about BBC journalists, think about, Simpson or Andrew Marr or something or other. But Lise, because she crosses both World Service Radio and World News TV, if you ever go anywhere with Lise outside of the UK, you risk getting mobbed, really. She's, and rightly, incredibly well known. I mean, she does some extraordinary journalism. And if you ever see Lise presenting live in the field, I don't know how she does it. She doesn't have scripts, she doesn't have teleprompters, but she will just work for hours of live television just from her specialist knowledge and her expertise and her understanding of the dynamics of television or whatever she's doing. She's brilliant. So that's one reason why I wanted some Lise Doucette in here, really, because I'm a big fan. The other thing about that is, again, the World Service is the only place really where you would probably get a significant interview like that with Yasser Arafat. I think it's very important that, somebody, whether it's now or then, as it were, challenging questions of the Palestinians and absolutely important to be done, and probably doesn't get done quite enough. But what's made that great, of course, was at least knew the story and knew the issues inside out. So, that's what made it a great Sonny Award-winning interview. And also, her skill as an interviewer meant as he was about to storm out, she managed to coax him back down and bring him on and carry on the interview. So it's a great piece of broadcasting.
Fantastic. Okay, let's just have a look, or listen rather, to the last piece, which is. Well, do you want to introduce it?
Yeah, this is a clip from World Have Your Say, which is a World Service programme about it's after Haiti, and it's Ross Atkins, the presenter, who's actually in Florida, in mini Haiti, talking to survivors.
And I could see all of you here from Haiti hanging on every word when René was describing which areas have been badly affected and which ones haven't. I couldn't quite tell whether you were relieved by what he was saying or not, ma'am.
No, I'm not relieved by it because I can't even think of they're gonna bury everybody together.
I'm sorry, we'll take the microphone away because I'm pretty sure you want a bit of time. And a number of people here are all comforting each other, and I'm sure everyone who's listening and everyone who's here wishes everyone in Haiti and those Haitians listening around the world all the best. If you want details of how to help people in Haiti, if you go to bbc.co.uk, you'll be able to find details there. If you would like to leave messages for people who've taken part in today's program, you can do so from the blog. We'll be live from Little Haiti in Miami tomorrow, but from Southwest Florida, goodbye.
So, I mean, the point about that, excuse me, is less that particular clip, although I think Ross is quite skilled in the way he handles a very kind of difficult and emotional moment. But World Have Your Say, which launched shortly after I took over Global News and the World Service, is basically a global phone-in with some kind of blog content brought into it and so on as well. But, you know, it can respond to huge breaking international news incredibly powerfully, is the first thing, you know, by going there and bringing in survivors and connecting them with the rest of the world. And that's the second point, really. In a world that's ever more interconnected and interdependent, the BBC, through a programme like that, almost uniquely can provide a forum and provide a platform for people around the world to talk to each other. And, you know, there are other examples where discussing HIV/AIDS, people in Nigeria are able to talk to people in Tanzania through that programme, and there is no other means by which they could ever speak to each other and compare experiences on, you know, what is still a controversial issue in Africa and so on as well. And the third thing it did, as I say, it launched in about late 2004, early 2005, but it's a very different kind of programme for the World Service, and it's a very different sound, and it's much more modern, and it's kind of responsive and interactive, and that's very much the model for going forward, I think, for international broadcasting. So that's why I wanted to try and find a clip of World Have Your Say, and I think the team there do some fantastic work.
Besides the obvious things like the audience, what were the cultural differences between running a domestic news operation and a truly global one?
Well, I mean, the agenda is very different, obviously, so you have a very different news agenda and news priorities and all the rest of it. It is about the audiences in the end, because you know, in the UK you get very fixated on the demographics and the reach and the, you know, understanding a particular UK audience. And of course, a global service, you can't have that granularity, that level of detail of understanding of the audiences. And yet, paradoxically, the audiences that you have are, you know, much bigger than a UK audience and actually much more highly appreciative. And for me, going across to global news out of the kind of aftermath of Hutton, the main contrast was, rather than going into work every day ready to face a barrage of complaints and hostility, even if it isn't Hutton, it's, you know, the Israelis or it's whoever, someone, when you run BBC News, you know every day you will have upset someone somewhere and have to deal with it. When you run the World Service, you know, you may have upset someone somewhere, but what you mainly get is people telling you how fantastic it is that you're there at all, and can you please do more, and isn't it wonderful? And it's just, it takes you a while, you know, sort of what's gone on here, you know. But, you know, the importance, it's still the case. I think it's Freedom House said that, you know, last year was something like the 7th year in a row where media freedom had declined around the world. You know, we take it for granted too much, and across, you know, the Middle East and North Africa and even places like Russia and so on, there are growing issues about media freedom, and something like the World Service is incredibly important and very highly appreciated, and it's not an anachronism and a kind of hangover from empire and the Commonwealth. It's more relevant and more important today than it was then.
Interesting. Okay, just a couple more things from me. It just occurred to me, listening to the names that you've chosen up here. You've got Brian Barron, Brian Hanrahan, Martin Bell, Fergal Keane, John Ware, Andrew Gilligan, Lise Doucette. You could have chosen, you know, a lot more. None of these are easy people to manage. shall I say.
I could have picked one or two more difficult ones as well, though, Vin, couldn't I?
I know. But you've spent your career managing what is known in the industry as talent. What are the tricks to managing these big beasts?
I always thought, again, kind of when I started going into newsgathering, having to manage some of these big egos, I had a very young family. And actually being the father to toddlers was the best training you could have for managing those kinds of egos, because basically it was exactly the same. You had to provide them with a framework. You had to go in every day and tell them how great they were and how much you loved them. And yes, that that TV piece or that crayon drawing was absolutely brilliant, and you were going to put it up on your wall, and it should win an award. But just don't go any further than that, or you're going to be in trouble. Okay, and that's basically what it was about. Or the other thing Greg Dyke used to say about talent was you have to go in every day and tell them 10 times a day how much you love them until you finally get fed up and sack them. I'm not sure I'd be quite that hard, but it's a facetious answer. But these people are incredibly talented. It's the very rare skills that they have to be able to write, to put themselves through those experiences, to be that driven, to deliver it day in, day out. Excuse me. And they need support and they need appreciation and and the rest of it, but at the same time they also need to know that they're working in a system and in a framework, and there are limits, and you have to build that relationship with them, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay, great answer. Okay, last thing, we were going to have we've got a picture of Richard's blog.
Oh dear.
Is that it? There it is. Oh, it's
good, isn't it?
It's very exciting. I promise you.
Yeah.
The most picturesque.
So you managed to run. You pulled off something extraordinary, I think, actually, and you managed to run the global division, and you became this kind of globally respected guru on citizen journalism, social media.
Yeah, it's a bit of a joke, isn't it, really?
Well, no, you did it. You did it. I mean, was that an accident, or did you set out with the full intention to do that?
It's a bit of both, because about 5 or 6 years ago, I started to get interested in what the internet was doing, and social media and blogs and all the rest of it. And I suppose the only thing I would say is I was a little bit, not very much, but a little bit ahead of the curve in recognising what the consequences of that could be for journalism, for the media, and started to talk about it and write about it and so on as well. And I also took the view that unlike some of my senior colleagues who had people who understood this for them, that actually if you needed to wanted to understand it, you had to do it. And I still believe that's absolutely true. So, I think my kind of colleagues on the board of the BBC thought had gone a bit bonkers, really, and I started having my own blog and talking about these things and all the rest of it. But it grew quite quickly, and actually, because I was 6 months ahead of other people wanted to know what I thought about it, and so I talked about it, and it was an interesting area to get into for me. And having come out of a very highly politicised, difficult kind of 18 months of Hutton and all the rest of it, to actually say, I'm going to talk about something completely different. Excuse me. Was very refreshing.
Yeah. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, one last question from me. Only a fool would try to predict what's going to happen to journalism in 10 years' time, let's say. So can I invite you to be a fool? And
yeah.
What are the themes and where are we going to be in 10 years' time?
I think the internet for breaking and daily news is going to become more and more important. What I worry about is where the space is on the web for what we call current affairs and investigative journalism. Excuse me. Because I don't think it exists at the minute. I don't really see it or feel it anywhere. So that's what worries me quite a lot. I'm at the minute at the Reuters Institute at Oxford trying to think about the future of foreign news and foreign reporting and all the changes that are impacting on it, which are not just about the internet and digital and so on, although those absolutely are. They're also, in a more interconnected world, a more globalised world, an expat correspondent of the kind that Brian Barron was in 1975 just doesn't kind of work in the way that it used to. So what are those changes going to mean over a period of time and so on as well? But as we talk about all of that, I'd come back to that primary point about bearing witness, because I do think that technology and social media, and we can find out about Haiti from Twitter, and you know, look at Iran on YouTube and so on. All of that is true, but in the end, that primary function of the foreign correspondent was, in terms of bearing witness, going there, doing what Fergal did in Rwanda, is absolutely crucial. And there was a great quote which I picked up here from Roger Cohen, the New York Times foreign correspondent, about this, who said, if I can read it, I can't read with glasses on. It's the trouble with age, it's time to go. Here we are. No news aggregator tells of the ravaged city exhaling in the dusk, nor summons the defiant cries that rise into the night. No miracle of technology renders the lip-drying taste of fear. No algorithm captures the hush of dignity, nor evokes the adrenaline rush of courage coalescing, nor traces the fresh, raw line of a welt. Well, it's very colourful writing from Roger Cohen, great writing, but that's absolutely true. And in the end, that's what, you know, international reporting is about, bearing witness and being there to report those things back.
Okay, fantastic. Questions? Who's got some questions? Yes, can you just the rules of this, can you just wait for the mic, because it's being recorded? Sorry there, you stick your hand up.
Rowan Bridge, BBC News 5 Live. You said that you would defend everything that was said in the Andrew Gilligan's 2 I just wonder how you feel about Mark Byford's subsequent apology that was then issued a few days later.
Well, you know, the BBC, as I said, went into a spasm and went into this kind of vacuum, and I don't think Mark had any option. You know, there was a real possibility that the BBC would kind of, you know, implode and collapse. And, you know, he had to steady it. And, excuse me about the cough. You know, I don't think anyone in his position, you know, his job was to steady the BBC and steady the relationships with the government, and there was no question that that's what was expected. And therefore, in terms of the longer view, you know, he did what he felt he had to do, and, you know, I respect him for that. And I think, you know, there were a lot of things that Andrew did that were wrong, and there were some things that were indefensible in my view. But the actual script and words he said there, I could bring all sorts of reasons to bear to say that actually it turned out to be exactly right. You know, probably knew it was wrong. Have David Kelly on tape to Susan Watts saying, you know, in their heart of hearts, they knew it was the wrong thing to say. Heart of hearts, wrong thing to say, probably knew it was wrong, you know. In terms of Downing Street, the memos that have come out since Hutton, the Downing Street memo, Jonathan Powell emails and all the rest of it, they stand up what Gilligan said. Inconveniently, but it's true. Okay, more questions? Yes, William. Go on here. Sorry, William.
Gideon Litchfield from The Economist. I know no one has been able to answer this question, but relating to the last thing that you said about the value of foreign reporting, do you have any thoughts on how it's going to be paid for in the future, apart from in the BBC?
No, I mean, Gideon, obviously, if I had that solution, I wouldn't be sitting here, I'd be out doing it. Excuse me, I don't know what's gone on here. You know, I support the Rupert Murdoch argument to the extent that we need to put a value back on original content. I don't particularly agree with his proposal for doing it. I think something like the kind of metered approach, the freemium approach, whatever you want to call it, that the New York Times is doing, and the FT's doing, probably is the right model for the web. But I do worry that, you know, the costs of the big bureau, you know, are going to be unsustainable. Now, I think there are alternatives, and I think you can do lots of things with the web and social media and different kinds of relationships with, you know, more networked approach to freelancers and stringers and journalists and all the rest of it. But in the end, to have someone who can write like Roger Cohen or report like Brian Barron in place is incredibly important, and there is a big economic problem around that.
Yeah.
William Bosley, ex-BBC. Richard, I'd like you to say a bit more about why it matters or what difference it makes. You talked passionately about, you know, getting governments to live up to their commitments and so on. And when you travel to other parts of the world, not very far away, Italy, even France now, you find journalists talking in despair about the fact that they can't hold power to account. They're losing the grip. In your estimation, after all these years, how do you define the difference that it makes to have independent, practicing, inquiring journalism as part of the fabric of life, which, on the whole, we have in this country, I guess you'd say. I mean, Charles Wheeler once said, he didn't think his reporting actually made any difference to what happened, but cumulatively, does it make a difference to have the BBC out there as a player asking the questions and holding power to account?
Definitely, definitely. I mean, I subscribe to the basic principle of the fourth estate. Sorry about this. We are there to hold people to account, and that might be John Humphreys at 8:10 on the Today programme, or it might be Fergal in Rwanda. But that's an incredibly important function, and even the tabloid press, which everyone can kind of be very high-minded about. There's a very good book out by an American academic called Michael Schudson called "Why We Need an Unlovable Press." Quite a small pamphlet, but it absolutely explains very compellingly why even the tabloid press are a vital part of a democratic system. And it is about the fact that without pressure on Parliament, without pressure on governments and politicians, without pressure on rebels and all the rest of it, a lot more would go on. It is definitely a brake on corruption and on bad behaviour of all different kinds. So I mean, I think it's, and you can't do it by remote control or being an arm's length. What worries me as I leave the profession is that people confuse debate and discussion with primary journalism. And it's the old C.P. Scott quote, comment is free but facts are sacred, because there's no point having comment unless you've got a solid foundation of fact. And it's that business about evidence-based journalism. Who's going out there to gather the evidence on which you can then have a debate or a discussion or hold people to account or have an opinion or whatever else it may be. And I do worry, the point about news on the web, and there's a paradox that there are hundreds of new sources of news on the web, but most of them are the AP and Reuters. What's happening in terms of that primary news gathering function is incredibly important. Yeah, John.
Richard,
Hi, John.
You said that when you left school, your teacher gave you advice about what careers to go into. If you were leaving school now, would you still choose to go to journalism?
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. Because
you encourage your kids to go into?
Well, one of them's going into. I think he's got music, radio more in mind than journalism, unfortunately. But one of them's definitely going to go into the media. I think at least. It is still, I think, a fantastic profession. It gives you, the opportunity to absolutely ask awkward questions, to be difficult, to poke your nose into all sorts of places, to find out what's happening in the world and how the world works. If you're lucky, it gives you the opportunity to travel the world and witness moments of history. There's nothing else like it. So, I very much hope that people would still choose to go in. What skills they need are changing very rapidly. So, if someone wants to go into journalism, I'd say, they need to be able to film, they need to be able to edit audio, they need to be computer literate, they need to understand social media, they need to do all sorts of things that I didn't need to be able to do 30 years ago. But still a fantastic opportunity.
Thank you. Mary Dojewski from The Independent. I've got two questions. One of them about...
you can only have one because there's a lot of other people.
No. One of them about BBC World. Most countries, or it's becoming increasingly the practice for countries to have a national flagship television service. We have the World Service, which is lionised and imitated throughout the world. But our television service, World Television, is commercial. Is there not a case for that being a state-funded service? And the second question, just a little observation. You had, I think, 10 clips, or around about 10 clips. One of them was of a woman. Would you just like to comment on that?
Yeah, okay, I'll take the first one first. There's certainly a case for BBC World News being publicly funded like the World Service, but it's a case that successive governments have rejected. So the choice we've got is to have a commercial television channel or none, and therefore I think it's much more important that we have a commercial one. I think the world has struggled over the years to, for that reason, to be as good as it needs to be. I personally believe, I would say this, wouldn't I, that I think over the last 5 years it's got a hell of a lot better. And I think there's further to go, but I think it's a really competitive and pretty polished product now if you watch it. And as it happens until the recession, it was also commercially a lot more successful. So I'm not somebody who says that a commercial news channel from the BBC can never work and is never going to be good enough. I think it can absolutely work, and it can absolutely be good enough, and can absolutely be competitive. And I think World News has come a long, long way. It's probably got a bit further to go. I absolutely agree with you, with the implication of what your observation was about women as well. There are certainly other women I could have chosen, you know, Kate Adie, obviously, but many other excellent women reporters. But when you go back 30 years, as I was invited to do, and my predisposition is towards international reporting, it's a historic fact that the majority of reporters happen to be men. That doesn't mean to say I think they're all necessarily better or there aren't alternatives and all the rest of it. What I see around me now are some fantastic women correspondents, absolutely around the world, and doing a lot of great reporting. But I was trying to put together something that encompassed 30 years.
Okay, class. Just here. Next.
Sunshine Flint, the lecture channel.
Could you speak up or put the mic on, one of the two?
Closer, is that
All right.
better?
Yeah, thank you.
Sunshine Flint, the lecture channel. What does Chief Content Officer for Edelman do?
I'll better tell you on May the 2nd, I think.
This is a reference to Richard's new job at Edelman, which is Chief Content Officer.
All right, so let me just say a bit about that. So I decided to leave the BBC after 30 years. I'd done more and had more opportunities than I ever expected to have in journalism. In deciding to leave, thinking about what to do, there's not another job for me in the BBC. There isn't anything else for me to do, and I've run out of road in the BBC, and I don't see another job in news or journalism that would be a step on from what I've done. So I rather took the decision to say, draw a line, you know, don't rule out ever going back at some stage into news or journalism, but draw a line, that was fantastic, move on and do something different. Edelman approached me about a role. I never particularly planned to go into PR, but you know, the lines are all getting redrawn by digital pretty radically at the minute. And I think Edelman are a very interesting organisation who recognise that, and they also recognise that they are getting into content production because of digital media in a way that agencies like that have never been in before. And to their credit, they recognise that in moving into content production, they need some experience and some, you know, values, and somebody who can oversee how all of that is done to the right professional standards. So, you know, they're going to be making websites, we're going to be doing documentaries, we're going to be doing all sorts of things that are paid for by corporate clients and will sit on websites or wherever. And my job is to oversee that and put a framework in place and you know, hopefully explore that new territory that's opening up outside of the media for companies to produce their own content. Andy, yeah.
Hi, Andy Griffey, BBC. Richard, having kind of divided your career between Bush House and TV Centre, are you sad or relieved that you won't be leading the charge into Broadcasting House when both operations come together?
Oh, sad, definitely. I mean, because I think it's a fantastic opportunity to bring radio, television, World Service, UK News together, and stirring that pot up and seeing what comes out of it and where those opportunities are will be as good as building news gathering in the 90s or some of the other, you know, big changes we've been involved in. Sorry about this.
Other questions?
Just quickly, Mr. Sambrook, no journalist background, ex-HM forces. I met Martin Bell a couple of times in your clip, kind of refreshed my memory, on the ground in Bosnia. The first time, I think his owner played a Land Rover, which I think he recalled called Miss Piggy at the time.
Piggy.
That broke it down. The second time was in '95, towards the end of the war, during the Dayton Accords. And he complains about what you mentioned about the BBC not showing enough of the graphic results of war. But he also complained about something which he felt the BBC lacked at the time, which was not displaying the positive sides of the conflict in Bosnia. And I wonder if you comment about that, or comment if that's changed with Iraq or Afghanistan.
Okay, it's a very good question, but quite a complicated one. I definitely agree that we need to show the impact of conflicts in the round, and to the extent that there is, nation building or there are other, good things going on, that needs to be part of the picture. However, it's also true, particularly in daily news, it's incredibly difficult to build that in. Because daily news is a snapshot of the most dramatic changes or shifts that have happened that day, and that tends not to be capacity building processes or those sorts of things. So I think in order to reflect that rounded picture, you need to look to current affairs and documentary and all the other kinds of things that you do, and features on a Today programme or whatever else it may be, and not say every aspect of every issue and every story needs to be reflected in every 30-minute news programme. News channels probably ought to be able to do more than that because they've got the space, but they may not always have the resources to do it. So I have sympathy up to a point. I think the argument that says there needs to be more positive news and good news in the daily news bulletins is probably not quite right, but I do think broadcasters have a responsibility to show a broader sense of what's happening in the country, and absolutely including Afghanistan at the moment.
Okay. Anyone else? Yep. Time for one more, if anyone's got one more question.
Rosie Hosking, I'm the editor of a cell biology journal, and so I pay particular attention to the science on the news. And I wondered if you had a comment on whether you think how science is represented on the main news gets it right. One comment is on climate change, which is that it's so complex and none of the scientists know what's going on, and how you can reflect that in a constructive way to the general public. And then another famous case is Andrew Wakefield in the MMR scandal, where there was one maverick and the entire scientific community disagreeing with him. And when you have two talking heads, the temptation is to feel that the opinion in science is 50% on one side and 50% on the other.
So I think we've all learnt from the MMR example, though I don't think the faults were quite as egregious as they've been sort of rewritten to be with hindsight. Climate change, you're right, it's incredibly complicated. All we can do is try and have dedicated correspondents and producers who make the effort to understand it, or more importantly, nurture the experts and the contacts to be able to make a judgment about how you fairly and reasonably reflect where the state of science is and where those judgments lie. I'd say it's quite important to reflect a diversity of view, but of course you're absolutely right, that doesn't mean applying equal weight to every view. And if there's an overwhelming consensus, then the viewer or the audience or the reader needs to be aware that that is the overwhelming consensus. And it comes back to the point about transparency in news judgments that we made before. I think an openness with the audience that says, we've come out with this position or this judgment because, and then if the audience chooses to disagree with the grounds on which you've made that judgment, at least they can understand and know what it is. So if it's an overwhelming consensus versus one maverick, that needs to be made clear.
Okay. Richard, final question. Just down here.
Richard Jarrett, BBC. Richard, very simple question, really. What's, at the end of your BBC career, what was the best bit of it? What was the happiest time? What was the most satisfying?
Well, there was, you know, the pint you bought me in the Yorkshire Grey in 1982, Richard, which was particularly good. I suppose I'd come back to the Berlin Wall probably, or China. Some of the excuse me, foreign trips that I made in the late 80s, and the chance to sort of see the world and see what's happening on the ground. And you know, in the end, for me, particularly with television journalism, there's nothing that beats working in a small team out on location on a kind of breaking, big, major news story. I mean, the kind of camaraderie and the spirit, and you know, that is the best experience you can have, in my view.
Okay, just one final thing from me. Yeah, when you read the press cuttings each day about the BBC, it feels a bit like being in Sarajevo in 1992. Yeah. You know, do you leave the place in a dangerous situation, or is it just the latest in a series of bombardments that the organisation comes under?
After 2004, I stopped reading the press cuttings, and I feel a lot better about it. Seriously, I used to, as director of news, the first thing you do when you come in the morning is read the press cuttings about the BBC, which are like that, and you'd be depressed from 9 o'clock onwards. And I just stopped it. Now I have an international brief. I don't really care what the UK press is saying about the BBC so much. So less facetiously, what that means is these criticisms come and go, and yeah, my expenses are in the Daily Mail last week, but you know, who cares, frankly? I don't really care. Yes, you know, I did go to China in October. You know, I'm director of Global News. Who gives a stuff? You know, so you know, you kind of get that in perspective is the first thing. And the bigger question, I think the BBC, I think it's getting more politicised, as you've seen public service broadcasting in other countries become. But I still think you know, we have huge strength and we have huge public support, crucially, and I don't think any government is going to want to mess about unduly with the BBC. You know, the danger, I think, is with kind of little tweaks at the top which have long-term effects in terms of our funding and our governance and all the rest of it, which may weaken us in the long term. But I think the BBC is a unique institution. Nobody would invent it again. But it's a quite extraordinary organisation with its faults as well as its virtues, but its virtues outweigh its faults. And I think as long as people go on, you know, articulating the value and the importance of what we do, and that the audience continues to want to watch and listen and read what we do with high levels of appreciation, it'll be fine.
Okay, thanks very much. A big thanks to David Hayward from the College of Journalism, to Julie and the whole team from the Frontline Club. Thanks to you for your questions. But very best wishes for his new career, and very many thanks to Richard Sambrook.
Thanks so much.